Hello and welcome to discussion today on Rajya Sabha TV. I'm Tina Jha. On the show today, we will talk about the role of the private sector in the country's development. Now, let me explain to you the context of why we are discussing this today. While replying to the motion of thanks on the President's address in Lok Sabha on Wednesday, Prime Minister Narendra Modi spoke of the crucial role that the private sector plays, as along the public sector, in the growth of the economy. He cited the examples of how private participation in mobile manufacturing has brought sort of a revolution in the country, in the sense that today each and every person, the poorest of the poor, also owns a smartphone. He also spoke of the role of the private players in the telecom sector, as a result of which he said call and data rates have reduced drastically in the country. And most importantly, he said, in fact, the Prime Minister highlighted that today India is able to serve humanity because of the crucial role that the private sector is playing in the pharma industry. And in this regard, he emphasized on the need to give more importance to the private sector, stressing on the fact that a country progresses only when each and every sector collaborates and contributes to its growth. So on this edition of discussion today, we will analyze the role of the private sector in India's growth story. And for this, we are joined by two experts on the program. Let me introduce them to you. We have with us Mr. Saurabh Chandra, Chairman MCX and former Secretary DIPP, the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. Welcome on the program, sir. And Dr. Anil Kumar, he's Associate Professor, SRCC. I welcome you on the program as well, sir. Let me begin with you, Mr. Chandra. Before we start talking about the role of the private sector, let me get your remarks on what the Prime Minister said. Very interestingly, privatization, promoting the private players has been something which the governments in the past have not spoken about so outrightly. For the Prime Minister of the country to actually defend or sort of promote the private players from the floor of Parliament, what does that indicate for you?
It recognizes the crucial role of the private sector in the development of the country. Now, development, as I understand it, is growth with equity. Now, to ensure growth, the role of private sector is critical. You have mentioned about privatization. I presume it means privatization of a large number of public sector units.
Yes.
This is something which needs to be done. You see, we have invested a lot of money into the public sector enterprises. A number of them are sick. Putting in more money is a typical example of sunk cost bias. You're throwing good money after bad. So this is high time that privatization of some of these public sector units is done. Similarly, there is talk of privatization of at least 2 public sector banks. Now, for example, the market cap of HDFC is about 2.5 times that of the State Bank of India. This is how the investors look at the private banks vis-a-vis the public sector banks. And in particular, the biggest problem facing this country is employment. Now, we have to generate a large number of jobs. And for this, the role of MSME sector is critical. The MSME sector is in the private sector. They have to be incentivized. Now, to incentivize the MSME, you need to do A, factor reforms, that is reforms for land, labor, and capital.
Yes.
B, you have to ease the regulatory environment. C, you have to create infrastructure and in particular, ensure that there is grid electricity available to these units so that they don't have to rely on high cost power on liquid fuels.
Okay. Mr. Kumar, your perspective on what the Prime Minister said on, promoting the private sector in the country so as to ensure development in the country. And when we talk about reforms, this particular government has not just spoken about reforms, but also brought in several reforms ever since it has come to power. So how do you describe the government's moves, especially when it comes to reforms and talking about privatization, which have not been so upfront by the previous regimes?
See, the 1991 Structural Adjustment Program was based on LPG, liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Since that time, we have not looked back, and our country, our economy is growing like anything. Just before the pandemic, our growth rate was GDP growth rate was between 7 to 8%, and in the next year, by most of the projections, including by the IMF, we are going to have a double-digit growth in our GDP. How this has been made possible? This is, I would say that today 90% of the GDP of the country comes from the private sector, whether it is agriculture sector, whether it is service sector, or it is manufacturing sector. Right now, the focus of the government has been in the last 3-4 years to encourage the manufacturing sector and to have the global competitiveness. This was also emphasized by Atmanirbhar Bharat Abhiyan, which was launched in May 2020. Under that scheme, I will mention some of the parameters on which work has already been done and is being done. One very good scheme is that of PLI, that is Production Linked Incentive Plan, under which the global manufacturing companies have been invited. You please set up your industries, manufacturing plants here, and you make for India and you make for the world. This is a slight tweak which has taken place from make in India to made in India and made for the world. And for that, a substantial outlay has been made for the PLI scheme in 13 important sectors of the economy. When we talk of ease of doing business, today, India is at the 63rd position worldwide. Imagine that India was, 4-5 years back at a place higher than 150. It was very difficult to do any business or set up any business in this country. The startup mission of the government of India. Today we have more than 14,000 registered startup in this country, and India has the second largest ecosystem so far the startup is concerned. So all that is being reflected in our growth in the GDP. Now, I'll take a few examples. During lockdown, when the pandemic was, knocking at our door, hardly there was any manufacturer offering PP kits and 95 masks. The ventilators were inadequate. And then, thanks to the private sector, not only the private sector was able to meet the domestic requirement of PP kits and also the N95 mask and ventilator, we were able to export it also.
Absolutely.
Today, again, because of the private sector, India is, I would say, the hub of vaccination program. The 60% of the total world vaccine, I'm talking about all the vaccine, are supplied by our country, by the private sector. Now the COVID vaccination program is in progress. And again, the two private players have come into the forefront. Other two companies are also working on developing the vaccine against COVID. It has been very successful. Think of any sector, you will find that without the participation of the private sector, private investment, it would not have been possible. We have the 5G technology again being developed in this country in collaboration with Google. Again, that's a result of private initiative. Government cannot be in the business, as rightly pointed out at the beginning of starting of the first term by this government, that our motto would be and has been also less government and more governance. That let the private sector take the lead and government is there to regulate the private sector, to see that private sector acts in the interest of country as a whole. So that way I think that this, I would say that this, substantial jump in the development is going to take place entirely on account of the private sector. That is why the government has also announced the policy of public sector. Let the public sector be there only in a few strategic sectors. And that too, 1 to 4 public units is enough. See, in a small city, think of a situation again. A small city, in the same city, on the same street. Why should the 4 banks, the public sector banks, have the branches doing the same work? Why can't just there be one branch? So that is how the government talks about consolidation of public sector units and disinvestment of the other units.
Okay. So, Mr. Chandra, the Prime Minister also has spoken about several sectors in which we are doing remarkably well and largely driven by the private sector. He, as well as Mr. Kumar, mentioned telecom industry, the pharma industry, and today our performance in these sectors is very, very good. Which are the other sectors, according to you, the non-strategic ones that require private sector players to be encouraged?
The future depends on 2 things. One, semiconductors. We need to have the best semiconductor facilities in the country. Secondly, we are talking about the electric mobility. Now, it is the private sector which will drive the battery technology. It should not happen that our dependence on oil is replaced by a dependence on batteries, basically lithium-ion batteries from China. So those are the 2 sectors which need to be looked at. One, chips, semiconductor chips, their fabrication, and the other is battery technology. Can we go in for some other element to drive the battery technology? Should we look at the hydrogen economy, mobility? How do we cut down our dependence on imports? Today, our dependence on crude oil imports is about 85%. Now, this is certainly not acceptable or sustainable.
Okay. Mr. Kumar, you spoke about, promoting the private sector, saying that the government has no business to run a business, and this was asserted by this government. But there are some sectors in which this could lead to a monopoly or a duopoly. So how can that be checked? What are the kind of regulatory measures that need to be put in place then?
See, all the regulations are in place. Now the government talks about, coming out with a unified securities code. We have the unified labor codes also to ensure that the labor is not exploited, to ensure that all social security measures which are to be provided to the labor, whether it is provident fund, whether it is insurance, whether it is minimum wages, all these parameters are fulfilled. Now this government is working on the parameters of transparency and disclosure, that whatever a company does, whether it's in the public sector or in the private sector, it should be transparent. That all the things should be disclosed. So far as the procurement policies are concerned, these have been made, very transparent through the electronic form. So now we have the system of electronic surveillance also. For example, in the private sector, if the private banks are encouraged, we cannot expect that private banks will do poorer as compared to the public sector. There will be frauds in the private sector. Frauds are there, or NPA problem is there in the public sector banks, rather more in the public sector bank than in the private sector bank. So why not to have a system where which we can have the strict regulatory control over the private sector and then ensure that equity is ensured for everyone. In the insurance sector, for example, in the recent announcement in the budget by the Honorable Finance Minister, the FDI limit on the insurance has been hiked from 49% to 74%. Thinking that, 49%, you are allowing the stake of 49%, who will come, without any majority stake? So now it has been hiked to 74%. Global investment, private investment would be coming. And because of that, the global practices would also come. Then we have all the regulations in place, whether it is in the sector of banking, whether it is in the sector of insurance, whether it is in the sector of consumer goods, name any sector. We have all the controls thanks to the developments which have taken place. Now the age of internet is there, artificial intelligence is there, data mining is there, data analytics is there. Because of all these measures, it's possible to have effective control over the private sector to ensure that they do not exploit the public, they do not exploit the employees, they do not exploit the customers. So all these things are in place. I do not think that there is going to be any problem when you are making more and more private investment in this country.
Okay. Dr. Chandra, do you agree with the point? And also, let me add one more concern that is largely there in the public mind when it comes to promoting the private sector, that if given a free hand, it leads to wealth creation in limited pockets. And that profit, of course, is not shared, is not beneficial to the public or to the country. So if we are promoting the private sector, how can this also be balanced?
Now, this is linked to your previous question, which talked about monopoly, or duopoly, or oligopoly. Now we have a competition law in place. We have a competition commission in place. Now, in case, just in case, there is some additional teeth to be given to the competition law, that should be done. Now, the question comes of wealth creation. If there is healthy competition, then wealth creation would be limited and it would be spread evenly. See, profits largely come out of monopolies or duopolies or cartelization. So it has to be ensured that this kind of windfall profits are not available. And for that, the regulatory checks have to be placed. See, the government has to create an ecosystem where there's competition. It will be the same thing when you're going to privatize public sector units. There has to be adequate compensation. All that the government would do is fix a reserve price. What the government would actually get would depend on how much competition there is. If there are only one or two players, it's not going to get the kind of price it wants, and you will have the same kind of complaints that were made when the earlier privatization drive took place. So the idea is that you need a lot of players coming in. There has to be healthy competition, and that by itself should ensure that nobody gets away with the kind of profits that one believes they can get away with.
Okay, Mr. Kumar, you wanted to add something on the issue of wealth creation?
The private sector, they provides the risk capital, and they, by making investment, they create the wealth. Now, is there any harm in creating the wealth? Creating the wealth for whom? For the nation. It adds to the GDP of the country. It adds more and more jobs. When you are creating wealth, you are creating jobs also. That means you are opening up the employment opportunities to thousands of young people who are looking for employment after passing out their courses, after passing out their engineering degrees and so on. So, what's the problem in wealth creation? Wealth creation amounts to, if it is done through fair means, within the legal framework, it amounts to, I would say, the nation building.
But how do you build that trust among the masses? Because whenever such reforms are talked about, apart from the opposition parties, which of course give a political angle to it, a large section of the society is also convinced that this is in a way only to benefit some private players.
Now, as I had started this discussion with saying that there has to be growth with equity. So whatever gains of GDP are made, they have to be distributed equitably. It is only when they are not distributed equitably that this kind of perception builds up. And the government, the state has a role to ensure that the gains of development are distributed equitably. Now, depends on how the wealth is created and for what purpose the wealth is used. Now, nobody is really going to grudge the people who created Infosys, the kind of money they made. And if you were to read what was said was even drivers, because of the shares that they got, made a lot of money. So within the organization, there was a fairly equitable distribution. Of course, the in a capitalist system, the ones at the top of the pyramid will always get a lot of money. That's how the system works. But whatever gains come, the base of the pyramid should not be very narrow. It should be wide, and the whatever gains come has to be distributed amongst all stakeholders. That is why there's talk of stakeholder capitalism.
Okay. So, when Mr. Kumar, Mr. Chandra is talking about development with equity. And with that regard, he's also mentioned some of his suggestions. What, according to you, is the best way to, ensure that growth comes with equity in our country?
See, when growth is there, it is all the sections of the society are benefited out of this. I'll give you examples. In the near future, the private sector is going to develop the 5G technology. And this country would be free from 2G technology. Who is going to be benefited out of it? Everyone, all the sections of the society. There will be fast internet connectivity also. I'll take few examples. Take a place, Kutch in Gujarat and Bhuj. Highly, it used to be undeveloped area. And now, in the last 10 years, one port, Mudra port, is a private port, which has been constructed, which has been set up. And you go there, you'll find that the whole belt of industry has developed in that region. That region has developed, providing jobs to thousands of people. Morbi is a place in Gujarat, which is a hub for manufacturing of tiles. Now the tiles, which are ceramic tiles, which are used in every household, in commercial establishments also, has become so cheap. All the customers are being benefited out of this. Imagine a scenario 10 years back when we used to import the ceramic tiles from abroad. It was very, very costly. So it has become very competitive also. So whenever the private sector is there and it is working in a free atmosphere with competition, open to global competition, the customers are going to be benefited out of this. We have seen this very clearly in case of telecom sector. Before the telecom sector was there in the private hands, there used to be government telephone company. And then MTNL came, BSNL came, situation improved slightly. But now with the private players, the customers, their tariff rate has reduced to nearly 10% or 20% what they were paying before, with better services also. Take the case of electricity distribution companies. Many private electricity distribution companies have been given the job of supplying and distributing the electricity in major cities of the country. The customers are benefited, they are getting the better facilities. And the tariff rate is also lower as compared to the earlier years. So I think that it is win-win situation for all the sections of the society. And when growth is there, as I said earlier, it will ensure equity for everyone because growth will benefit every section of the society. If good roads are there, infrastructures are there, good rail network is there, everyone would be benefited out of this.
Absolutely.
So automatically it will take care of equity. But at the same time, as I said that the regulations have to be effective. So far the labor regulations are concerned, protection of the rights of consumers are concerned, and other welfare measures are concerned. If the governance of the government is effective, it will take care of the equity element also. So far the people talking about it, talking against it. We are in a democratic country. So in a democracy, everyone has a right to raise the voice. But it is for the people to understand that whether these voices are prompted by some political issues, political considerations or constraints, or these are the genuine issues. In case these are the genuine concerns of the people, the government is there to look after those concerns. But in case these are prompted by political considerations or other considerations, then I think that government should not pay much attention to that. We have seen at many, like I'll take this is not the right forum to raise this, but the farm laws which have been passed, don't you think that it is in the interest of the farmers? Everyone knows that, understands it. Then why this opposition? Why this protest? You are giving freedom to the farmers. So we live in a democracy where everyone has a right to raise the voice. The voices have to be heard, and in case any concession, any modification have to be done in the government policies, the government must be responsive enough to make the adjustments.
Absolutely. And it is also for the government to ensure that both the private and the public players work in collaboration, because that is the only way forward, the best way forward for the country to progress. Let me take one concluding remark from you, Mr. Chandra, on how we can achieve that, the perfect collaboration that the Prime Minister is talking about, especially when we are aiming to become a $5 trillion economy now.
See, I'll go sector-wise. For example, agriculture. Just as the Green Revolution was developed based on seeds developed in Mexico, similarly, our agricultural universities have to increase the productivity of agriculture production. The problem of the farm sector is because we are caught in this wheat paddy cycle. We have to get into crops which will replace crops that we import, like oil seeds, pulses.
Yes.
So agriculture research is one place where the public sector has a big role to play. And the marriage of the private and the public sector will take place with research and extension. When we come to manufacturing, once again, basic R&D for certain things has to be done in the IITs, in the other institutes, where academia and the industry have to collaborate. So once again, this is how we will grow manufacturing, because what we need is depth in manufacturing. We need a lot more value addition in manufacturing.
Yes.
See, the biggest the manufacturing countries are also the ones with the highest trade surpluses. If you keep the oil exporting countries apart, Japan, China, Korea, Taiwan, Germany. And when it comes to the services sector, as Professor Kumar has pointed out, there's plenty that the private sector has to do. Now, something which we haven't touched on is infrastructure. Now, infrastructure, we had the public-private partnership model. Now, it didn't work. And there are reasons why it didn't work. Now, what the government can do is, when it is bidding out these projects, it should have all clearances in place. Land acquisition stalled projects, environmental clearances stalled projects. So what the government has to do is create conditions in which the private sector can deliver. And the regulation that should be there should be selective, effective, certain, and whatever action has to be taken has to be taken quickly and with certainty.
Absolutely. So with those suggestions coming in from both our panelists, it's time for me to wrap up this edition of discussion today. Thank you to both of you for joining us on the program and sharing your perspective on this very, very important subject. Pleasure having you on the program. So that's it from us on discussion today. Let me remind my viewers that just in case you missed the television broadcast, you can also watch it on YouTube, and you can get back to us with your feedback and suggestions as well. Thank you for your time.